welcome back to our Balance of Power training series. I'm joined with Colin Derink once again, Vice President, Power Production. I'm Jonathan Oliver. I'm Chief Operations Officer here at AECC. So welcome, Colin. Glad to have you back. In our last two sessions, we covered topics like capacity versus energy. And we talked about environmental impacts and kind of what the focus is today and how those environmental impacts are really causing a shutdown of plants like coal plants that we've seen. And from a public perspective, when we think about electricity, as we're talking about today, we probably don't think about some of these other side things, environmental and capacity energy, so technical terms. All we think about is, I know what electricity is, right? I know it keeps my lights on. I know it keeps my refrigerator running. I understand maybe how it impacts my life and how ubiquitous electricity is with everything that we do. It's so much so that we probably don't even think about it when we flip the switch, right?
Oh, absolutely.
But it impacts our lives daily. And I think you and I were talking a little bit earlier today. We don't think about where that electricity is coming from. It just comes from the wall outlet, and maybe it's the plant down the street. So I want to start off today talking about a term that we're going to hear a lot in today's session: watts. And for most homeowners, you'll typically see that on your power bill, and it's in kilowatt hours. And so the typical home uses somewhere around 1,000 or 1,100 kilowatt hours every month. And building on our concept of capacity versus energy, a kilowatt hour is energy. Okay, so it's the energy that they're using, but a kilowatt is demand. It's that instantaneous need to turn on that light or that hair dryer, or whatever it is. And so for utilities, we typically talk in megawatts. So a megawatt is 1,000 kilowatts, and a megawatt hour is 1,000 kilowatt hours. So really big. And for AECC, we serve thousands of homes and businesses through our member cooperatives. And so that takes thousands of megawatts in order to do that. And so, Colin, on our session on capacity versus energy, you had mentioned that AECC owns or has access to, I think, around 4,000 megawatts of capacity. Why don't you kind of remind us what types of resources AECC has?
We have over 4,000 megawatts of generation capacity. Two main buckets or categories I would put those in. On the fossil generation side of that equation, you have our plants, our coal plants and our gas plants. And then in the other category, the second bucket, we have our renewable resources. And so we have our hydroelectric plants, we have our wind farms, and we have our solar generation assets. And that kind of rounds out that over 4,000 megawatts of capacity you described.
Okay, so we've got a variety of resources. I can go back. My history here says, the mix matters. That was one of our campaign themes. And we have a pretty good mix of coal, natural gas, hydroelectric, wind, and solar. No nuclear, at least not now. But are there other types of resources that utilities may utilize to generate electricity?
Yeah, certainly. You just touched on one right there. Nuclear is a pretty big one in the country. Hasn't been recent developments in that, and we'll talk about that here after a time. But nuclear is a big player. Geothermal is a big player. We talked about wind, but there's a big offshore component to that as well that's unique, which creates much larger turbines and so forth. There's a storage component we'll talk about a little bit that you could describe as a generation in terms of battery storage. So there are quite a few different other technologies out there for generating electricity for sure.
Yeah, and we were talking earlier. I'm kind of a geek. I'm an electrical engineer, and I think there's even tidal, energy where you can use the waves to create electricity. But when you think about that, I think we've talked about a bunch of different technologies. But why don't you walk us through kind of how electricity is made?
Sure. Staying general and high level there, I think of that in probably three main ways, right? We have the mechanical component, we have chemical, and then we have a direct. Well, on the mechanical side, which is the most pronounced way that we create electricity, we're typically turning a turbine. And I think most of our audience can probably relate to that. So at our power plants, we're burning a fuel to make steam, which then turns a turbine. So that can be your coal plants or your gas plants. You take away the fuel component with a wind turbine, you're still turning a turbine to turn a generator, right? It's just the wind that's creating the lift on the blades and the propulsion to turn that turbine. So that's really the mechanical side, is we're turning that turbine and that generator to make electricity. On the chemical side, it's fairly straightforward. That's your batteries, right? So you've got the chemical reaction within the battery that's utilized there. And when I mentioned directs in the third category, that's the photovoltaics. And while it's not our intent to go into depth in terms of photovoltaics in this discussion, photovoltaics is simply the conversion of light energy into electricity. And so that's your solar farms.
Okay. So there really are only some limited ways to make electricity, and not to get too technical to push that electron down the wire. There's only, like I said, mechanical, chemical, and then direct or photovoltaics. And so I guess what we're really talking about is what is the technology behind those as we kind of go through this session. And so I know last time Stephen, in talking about environmental, said there's tons of regulations, and we're probably going to see a real wave over this next month impacting generation resources. And it's those regulations that are ultimately leading to the closure of coal plants. And for AECC, that's meaning the closure of White Bluff and Independence, some plants that we co-own here in Arkansas. But that's going on across the country in the United States, seeing a lot of coal plants closing down. So with coal essentially off the table, I don't think there's any utility that's planning on building new coal in the United States, at least. We've got to consider new technologies to meet that demand. So let's start off with renewables. And I know we talked about wind and solar maybe being in two of those categories that you mentioned there, but walk us through the good and bad of wind and solar, and maybe geothermal and other renewable technologies.
Sure. So lots of pros and cons to renewables, I think. On the positive side, the cost. Now, initially, you've got what can be argued to be a fairly high production, construction, development costs associated with renewables. But the big component that you eliminate is that variable cost of fuel, right? We get rid of that fuel cost. And when you're operating a power plant, such as a coal or a gas plant, your fuel cost is typically your highest cost of operation. So a fairly big positive piece there. The other component to renewables is, of course, you don't have the same emissions. We're not burning a fuel. And so we're not emitting the carbons and the nitrogen oxides and the sulfur dioxides and so forth, right? So a positive there. On the negative side, which we've hit on a little bit in some previous conversations, is the dispatchability. So now, because I don't have a fuel source to pull from, I really don't have control over when I generate from those resources and those assets. We obviously don't control when the wind blows or the sun shines, and so it's difficult for us to match our members' demands with generation from those types of resources. Lastly, I would probably just highlight the difference in land. The geographical space required for renewables is quite different. So at a coal plant, you could have several thousand megawatts potentially at a larger generation facility, pretty congregated, at that coal plant from one specific location. When you look at wind, initially construction-wise, you disturb quite a bit of land. Once that wind turbine is built, if I use maybe a more nominal size turbine of say 2 megawatts, pretty typical turbine today, about an acre to an acre and a half is disturbed. And so you are potentially able to, if that's farm ground, for example, you could still farm that land and so forth. But what I think folks often don't think about is, in order to get a significant size wind farm, it takes many turbines. If I'm only building a 2 megawatt wind turbine in my example, and you have to think about the placement of the adjacent wind turbines. So a wind turbine creates turbulence adjacent to it and behind it. And so typically you must be 6, 7, or even 8 what they call rotor diameters away from one turbine to the next. And so a wind farm overall takes up a lot of space, is really what I'm describing there. If you look on the solar side, you're anywhere from 4 to 6 acres per megawatt is typically what I've seen. And so there again, you're taking up a lot of land with that resource in comparison to some of those more confined resources like the coal or gas plants. So.
And I know, Colin, you had a lot of experience at your last job with renewables, in particular wind. And I know one of the issues with wind is what do you do when you decommission that turbine and those blades? Any insight on that? And maybe, what do you do with the solar panels once they're no longer useful? I mean, any thoughts there?
That's a great point, because that is definitely a challenge and somewhat of a negative. As we talk about pros and cons with renewables, it's very difficult to recycle, for example, wind turbine blades. There has been some progress made in that area, thankfully, but there are definitely some difficulties there. And once you realize the construct of a wind turbine blade with the balsa wood and the fiberglass and the steel belting and so forth, it's just very difficult to get those components out of there and recycle that. Similarly, on the solar side, we've got some challenges in terms of our ability to recycle solar panels. There are some options with a single-phase panel, but many of our, the later projects out there now are a bifacial panel where we actually pick up light resource from the top and the bottom side, if that makes sense. And so I'm unaware of technology right now that can recycle those panels. That's something we're working on.
Yeah, so it's interesting. We continue to talk about in our Balance of Power campaign that a megawatt of dispatchable resource like coal does not equal a megawatt of renewables like a wind or a solar. And we were really talking about that more from the standpoint of, like you said earlier, you can't pick and choose when you want that resource to operate. But there's similar things. There's environmental concerns with the disposal of those resources at end of life. I mean, you've got that with coal. I mean, there's a lot of things here that have to be considered. It's one thing to talk about how green they are, how wonderful they are, but you got to think about the end here.
There's environmental challenges with both. Certainly, they're just different, right?
That's exactly right. So, when we talk about not being able to use these renewable resources, we can talk about the land mass. Can you talk a little bit about rotor diameter? Any concept for the people maybe watching this or listening to this about how many acres it might take for a solar farm? I know we're building one right now at Woodruff. I mean, how many acres are needed for, say, 1,000 megawatt plant? Can you put that in perspective?
Oh my gosh, well, 1,000 megawatt plant would be a rather large one for the renewable space. But as I mentioned before, average 4 to 6, maybe 7 acres per megawatt on the solar side, and so you can map that out pretty well. You're going to have control of 700-800 acres for 100 megawatt solar site.
So for 1,000, make that 7,000 acres.
Right.
Yeah. I think a lot of our members are farmers, and when you start thinking about thousands of acres, they'll get a good picture of what that means. And I think for me personally, that's one of my concerns is that land use and how you tie that up. And even with wind turbines, quite frankly, you can farm underneath it, but you have other disturbances above that, obviously. So again, there's some good and bad about those. But I think as we talk about renewables, in particular wind and solar, and the people who are proponents for it, and they're good. I mean, I think as we do look at balance of power, all resources are good. And so there are good things about these, but the intermittency is problematic. And to solve that, most people talk about batteries. Okay. So tell me a little bit about the current state of battery technology.
Well, batteries are talked about because storage would be a game changer, right? If we could store this energy. But really, as we sit today, we don't necessarily have the technology and the scale at an economic standpoint that makes sense, that has a large impact. So if you look at battery technology, really the main player in the space has been the lithium ion option. A lot of discussion there, very expensive, have to go through a lot of mining activities and production work to make that happen, to get the lithium, right? And then you look at the sizing of it. I think we talked in a previous session about the 4-hour mark to discharge these battery projects.
And
is about all you get.
And that's when it's not 0 degrees outside.
Right. Yeah, it goes down from there, right? Performance worsens in the climatic conditions. But yeah, so there's definitely some shortfalls there. Lots of discussion in the battery space about different types of batteries. And so while nothing has really taken off yet, there's sulfur, sodium, you probably know others. There are many different types of battery technologies being discussed. And I think it's kind of that waiting game to see who the front runner is that really makes a difference. But I'm not necessarily convinced that lithium ion is the solution there. So
yeah, and lithium ion, there's a lot of competition. I mean, so we're talking in the United States, at least, about more and more EVs. Well, they use lithium ion as well.
That's right.
And there's been that talk about battery fires in EV vehicles. Well, there's been battery fires in plants too, and they're not exactly easy to extinguish.
Right.
So, yeah. So you talked about the duration of batteries. 4 hours ish. Is there any long duration storage technologies out there?
Well, that's a general term, so it's a little bit hard to say what we would consider long term. You know, the biggest player in terms of stored energy in our country is pumped hydro. So this is storage of water essentially. You have two separate reservoirs that are at different heights, and by pumping water to a higher reservoir and then discharging it down, turning a turbine again in the process, there's that mechanical component to turn that turbine, we create electricity. To my knowledge, the largest pumped hydro storage project in the country has a capacity of about 3,000 megawatts, and overall it can discharge 24,000. So if you do the math there quickly, it's about 8 hours that would be. So comparing that to batteries, it's longer, but it doesn't bridge the gap that we would need at times, especially during severe weather events and so forth. So.
Doesn't bridge the gap, and again, it's a land use issue. You know, if you think back of Hoover Dam, and there's a lot of questions about what that did with flooding. So you've got to create two reservoirs and some other things. So there's problems with that as well. And so, when you look at all of these renewable technologies, the good and bad, like you said, it's low cost. There's no fuel cost. There's no limited emissions. I won't say no limited emissions. And some other things. Batteries help solve that, but there's limited duration. So we're kind of getting into, we got to have something else. And I think for AECC, we're talking about natural gas. And so what can you tell me about the current state of natural gas technology?
Yeah, natural gas is becoming very popular for the reasons you mentioned, including those regulations that we touched on at the top. But if you look at gas turbine technology in particular, we're seeing larger, what are called advanced class turbines out there now that are larger in size and their ability to produce, but they're also more efficient. So efficiency's coming down, emissions are coming down, and we're able to produce more energy. So a lot of positive things there. Of course, the negative side is the reliance on the pipelines, the reliability of the gas pipelines and so forth. And then, of course, you always have that market volatility in terms of the price of the natural gas at any point in time that you need it. So that'd be the major downside, I guess, to the gas resources.
Yeah, so it's clean. They're getting real efficient. And I think it's interesting. You mentioned lower emissions just from the fact, when you burn a chunk of coal, that's pretty much all carbon.
Right.
If you look at the atomic structure of natural gas, it has some hydrogen in it. And we'll talk a little bit more about hydrogen in a minute. But right there, you cut your CO2 emissions in half just by burning natural gas. And now you're getting into some efficiencies with these new turbines that are really just incredible.
They are. They're fantastic.
And so it does seem to be a good technology to bridge that gap, specifically in lowering carbon emissions. So gas has its pros. It's dispatchable. It has some problems with the pipelines, and I know that's one of the issues we've been talking about. There's not a lot of pipeline construction. I know most people listening would know about the Keystone Pipeline. Not necessarily natural gas was the product on that one, but still you can get the perspective of what it looks like to build a pipeline in the United States. Very difficult. So there's some risks going forward with natural gas. And so if coal's off the table, we got some problems with renewables. Batteries don't keep us long enough. Natural gas is good, but has its issues. Are kind of down to nuclear. So let's talk a little bit about nuclear, and what can you tell us about nuclear technology today?
Sure. So nuclear was a big player decades and decades ago. We really haven't seen development of a nuclear power station, I think, since the early 80s or maybe 1980, something like that. But the big discussion here on nuclear is a bit of a revival, as we're talking about small modular nuclear now. And so this is a difference in technology that would allow you to have a smaller nuclear generation station, but yet with the modules, you could add modules to build that larger power plant. Because typically these nuclear stations can be several thousand megawatts in one plant. And so you don't necessarily always need that type of sizing, at least initially, right? So there are some advantages there. Nuclear certainly is very expensive. It always has been, and so that continues to be an issue. We also haven't seen anyone yet develop small modular nuclear. So while it's the hot topic and there's a lot of discussion on it, has some promise, has some hope, no one's really hit the ground running with it just yet. There's a couple projects I'm aware of that are getting some siting done and things like that, but someone has to take that first step, right, to see that that's done. And so that will be a challenge. Nuclear projects typically run over budget and long on schedule, so we'll see how that happens.
Yeah, we'll see if Bill Gates is successful in his project to develop nuclear power. So I guess the big question, and nuclear has always had this fear, is nuclear power safe?
That's a great question, because overall, really, if you look at the safety, performance, and record of nuclear, it's fantastic. It's really better than our other power generation resources. Typically far, far safer than a coal or a gas plant. There's lots of redundancy in equipment and components. There are a lot of safety mechanisms to make sure that that happens, and the performance there is very good, despite maybe some of the public perception that's out there.
Yeah, and I know we had researched, I was a part of some research on small modular reactors, and just the passive safety technology for these reactors. You could cut the power to them and they could go weeks without any issue, without a meltdown. So I agree with you. The technology is getting more and more safe all the time. And so what I'm hearing is nuclear is clean, it's safe, there's no emissions, it's reliable. Why aren't we building nuclear? I mean, why don't we go out there? I think our members, as a matter of fact, I've heard our members ask that question. Why aren't we going out there and building nuclear today?
Yeah, I mean, largely, I think it's the couple items that I mentioned. Cost, for sure, is a big one. And again, small modular nuclear is the hot topic, and it has a lot of promise, but there just hasn't anyone that's fully developed it just yet. And I think we need to see that pilot project, and we need to see some of these things come out and be constructed in order to gain some confidence that we can build one that's on budget and on schedule, right? Yeah. One thing I didn't mention with nuclear is really the way it operates and its ability to follow load. We didn't hit on that at all. Typically, nuclear just runs full out all the time. It is a base load type of generation resource. And so I think that's important, because with the influx of renewables, we talk about all of this wind and solar development, our plants, our gas plants and our coal plants and so forth follow that wind and that solar resource largely. Nuclear doesn't do a great job of that. And so there needs to be some work in that space. There's maybe some improvement in that being discussed with these small modular reactors we're talking about. That has to be seen yet.
You can't just turn a nuclear plant on and off. Right. It's harder to start up and shut down than coal. Coal takes about a day. Gas plants can take, several hours if they're combined cycle. And so you're right. You've got a really good resource, but it is meant to be on all the time. Well, great information, Colin. Here's kind of what I heard, kind of to recap things. Our current generation fleet has a good mix of resource, from coal to natural gas to wind and solar and even hydroelectric. But our coal's being shut down. And as we look to bridge that gap, we're primarily looking at natural gas because it has some characteristics that we need. It has capacity, it has that dispatchability, but we're also considering, additional renewables. Batteries are not quite there yet. They're still maybe a little ways out, although you can get them today. They're not as reliable as you think. They're costly. Same with nuclear. So I think what I'm hearing is some of these new technologies are maybe years to decades in the future, but there's promise out there. Great information. What else do you want to share with the audience about generation technology before we wrap up today?
Well, there's one thing we touched on earlier, and that was hydrogen. There's a lot of discussion about burning hydrogen right now, and many of these gas turbine manufacturers have the ability to burn some percentage of hydrogen. They've been proving that more and more. There's some advantages to the ability to burn hydrogen. We don't have the same emissions. You essentially don't have the carbon emissions. There's a little bit of a trade-off because you still have the nitrogen oxide emissions, right? So hydrogen is a little bit cleaner, but you're not completely clean, right? But the main issue with hydrogen at this standpoint is the production of it and then the distribution of it. We really don't have the sources, and again, we don't have the pipeline and the infrastructure and so forth to get the hydrogen yet. And so there again, as you said, many of these newer technologies, this fuel source of hydrogen included, are a ways out there in the future.
Yeah, and from what I've heard of hydrogen, it's up to 10 times as expensive as natural gas. And you'd mentioned earlier that on a plant that burns a fuel, that's your biggest expense. So you just 10 times more than what it is today.
That's right.
One last question for you. What is AECC doing to stay on top of new generation technology? Are we kind of staying plugged in, or what's your thoughts there?
That's the key component, I think, here. As you ask for additional comments, that is exactly how I would pose this, is that we're in such a transitional time in our industry right now. And in order for us to stay viable and to stay competitive and be there for our members in the future, we have to stay on top of these emerging technologies. This is a big, big issue and a big effort for us. And so we're involved in various trades organizations. You and I are talking discussions like this all the time. We do a lot of study, a lot of research, and so forth. So it is a big effort of focus for us because there are a lot of unknowns with where all this is headed.
Yeah. Well, Colin, thanks for your time today, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Yeah, thanks for having me.